Hi, I'm Missy with On William Street, and we are here to help you become a more confident quilter, from the piecing to the quilting and everything in between. This week, we're going to do a little twist on binding. So we are going to do what is referred to as flange binding. So it's going to be a little bit different than your typical binding, and you're actually going to need two fabrics for this binding technique. And you're going to need one that's going to be kind of your main fabric, and we're going to use this blue stripe. And then this orange is going to just give us a little pop of color in that binding, and we'll show you how. So the first thing we need to do is we need to get our fabric cut. So you're going to think this is a little bit backwards, but so our main portion of our binding is actually going to be a little bit smaller than the other section. So for our binding, we typically do 2 1/4 inch binding. This gives us just a really small binding, and it's what we prefer. If you do a bigger binding, then just make sure that you add some additional inches, not inches, but additional measurement to that for yours. So for this, our main portion of our binding, so the main amount that's going to show, which I'm going to refer to as the outside portion of the binding, we want to cut that at 1 1/4 inch wide. So we're going to line our ruler up. One 1/4 inches. And then we'll set that one aside. We're doing just a small mini, so we don't need to have quite as much as we would if we were doing a full quilt. So for the inside portion of the binding, we are going to cut them at 1 1/2 inch wide strips. And because we're using scraps left over from this block, I will need to cut a couple of strips for this one. Now that we've got all of our strips cut, we're going to need to sew them together. So we are going to sew our inside strips to each other, and then also we're going to sew our outside strips to each other. So we've got one long strip of each. We've got our strips sewn together. Now we need to sew these 2 strips to each other. So we're just going to place the smaller one on top, and then just sew a 1/4 inch seam all the way down. Now that our strips are all sewn together, we need to iron them. And what we're going to want to do is you want to make sure that you're ironing this towards the outside strip. So iron it towards the one that's a little bit shorter in width. We have our seams ironed, and then we've also ironed our binding in half all the way. So this is where you're going to be able to start to see just that little bit of peekaboo binding that we're going to get when we attach this to the quilt. So now we're just going to follow along, and just, if you want some more details on just a regular binding for quilting, you can absolutely find our binding video. We're going to bring it in. I'm going to attach it. I want to make sure that I leave some space up here so that when I attach the 2 binding pieces together. So I'm going to just, I like to add pins. You can use some binding clips or whatever works best. So I'm going to put a few pins on here, and when we come down to that corner, we're just going to do the same like what we do on a typical binding. We're going to fold that so we've got a 90-degree angle, and then fold it back again, and then continue to follow that seam all the way down, and when we get to the next corner, we'll do the same thing. So as we get close to this corner, we want to stop about a 1/4 inch past, and I like to just throw one little back stitch in there just to hold it in place. And as I mentioned, we're going to fold that fabric up and then back down, and then I'm just going to stick a couple of pins in just to hold it in place. I'm going to turn it around and then just start it up right again. I don't even clip my threads. Just kind of come back and follow it all the way down until the next corner. Now we need to get our binding connected to each other. So the method I like to use is I'm going to lay both of them out right along here, and then I'm going to use a marking pen to kind of mark that in that, about in the center. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark both sides of the fabric on every single one. And there is a reason for this. It's because I always tend to forget which one's going to be up and which one's going to be down. So if I do both sides, then it doesn't matter. And then we're going to need to unfold our binding. Lay that one so it's right side up, and then this one is going to be our right side down. Now this is going to be a little bit tight just because it is a mini. It's not going to be this difficult when you're doing a full quilt because you just have a little more space. And we're going to want to make sure you're just matching up those lines. So this line on the back, we want to make sure that's matching right there. And then we also want to make sure that the fabric is lining right up there as well. And stick a pin in there to hold it in place. And then same on this side. Make sure your line's right there along the edge of the fabric. Stick a pin up there, and then I'm actually going to put one in the middle as well. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to draw a line from corner to corner. That's going to help me make sure that when I sew this, I'm not getting off just a little bit in the center, because if we do that, then our flange is not going to line up quite the way we want it to. You want to make sure that that is a really nice angle for you, so that that will match up when we unfold this. Now as we're sewing this, just make sure that you're not getting any tucks on the other side. Bunch your mini up a little bit as you need to, and just sew right along that line. Now I am using what is called a stitch in the ditch attachment for my walking foot. This makes it really nice because then you can follow right along that line, but you can do this with just your regular foot or regular walking foot as well if you don't have this. And then when we flip it over, we've got, didn't quite match up as nice as I would hope so. So I might unpick that and just switch it up a little bit just so it matches up a little bit nicer than that. Apparently my angle got off just a touch. So we've got our seams attached. Now we can go ahead and we can cut a 1/4 inch, the 1/4 inch. Now that we've trimmed off our seams, so we've only got our 1/4 inch, we've sewn that. Now we need to go ahead and finish sewing it to the back of our block. So just make sure that you're following right there along the edge of the quilt. And stretch it out just a little bit if you need to. Now that we've got all of our binding attached to the back, we're going to flip it over and get it attached to the front. So this is where we can really see that little pop that's going to give us. Now I always like to kind of add a couple of pins again, or you can use binding clips again, whichever works best for you. And really I'm just doing just a couple right here at the beginning just to hold it in place as I get started. And then another tip for this, if you have a stitch in the ditch foot, that's going to make this so much easier, because what we want to do is we want to sew this binding right there in the ditch of this seam. So this foot will just help line things up really nicely for us. And then I also like to sew with my needle down when I'm doing this portion of the binding. That's just going to help when we get to the corners to line that up. Make sure you remove your pins before you get to them. Okay, so now that we're getting close to that corner, this is where I want to stop and get that flipped over so I get a really nice mitered corner. So I like to stick a pin in this side just to kind of hold that in place. And then I'm going to bring this up, fold it over, kind of give a little bit of a crease right there where it meets, and then fold it over. Make sure things are lining up nicely. You can kind of do it a couple of times. See, now I've got a little nice line up there. Stick a pin in there to hold it. And then one more. Whoops, I dropped that one. Right here to hold around the corner. So then we're going to sew right up to that corner, and that's where we're going to pivot. And then just go ahead and continue down until you get to the next corner, and you'll just repeat that process. Okay, and then again, as we're getting close to that corner, I'm going to stick a pin on this side to just help hold things in place. Lay that nice and flat, give it a little finger press, might help as well. And then fold that over, line it up. And then again, we'll stick a couple of pins in there and then sew to the point, pivot, and then keep going. Now our quilt is complete. We've got our binding on, and this binding is just really fun to add just a little pop of color or something unexpected to your quilt. Now make sure that you don't forget to subscribe to our YouTube channel and click the bell so you make sure you get notified every time we post a new video. We are posting videos every week, so different tutorials and how-tos, and you can also follow us on Facebook and Instagram to see what we're up to, and we'll see you next week.